Hi, so my name is Anya Kamenetz. I'm an advisor with Climate Mental Health Network, and I'm here with our wonderful collaborator, Panu Pihkala. Um, say hello.
Hi, Anya. Great to be talking with you again.
Thank you, absolutely. And we're really excited today because we're introducing our grief resources for climate and ecological grief, which we developed together based on many years of Panu's research. And Um, yeah, I guess the beginning, is to say what is climate and ecological grief and how did you arrive at some of the concepts that we're going through in the guide?
Mm. Yes, so my history with grief research started with general grief and bereavement research. Surututkimus in Finnish, my native language, and then moving on to various kinds of loss and grief that people feel in relation to environmental changes and damage. There was the task of integrating this more general grief research then with more specific ecological grief research. And that was fascinating, rewarding, difficult, time consuming, and now I'm very, very happy that several fruits of that have come out in the format of research articles, and now together with you, Anya, and others, we are trying to make that material more easily accessible.
What is the importance of understanding this type of grief? How can it help?
Hmm. And first of all, if you think about grief and related words in your own language, for those of you for whom English is not your first language, there may be different kinds of words that you have been using in relation to these feelings of loss and sadness and grief and so on. And I think that's an important point that there's all kinds of feelings related to sadness which can be evoked when there's negatively perceived losses and changes in the environments and in our relationships with the modern human world. So those feelings exist. There can be various reactions to them. Sometimes people try to escape those feelings or are sort of confused what to do with them, especially in industrialized societies. There's often been lack of social support and recognition for any kind of grief, but more specifically for ecological grief. Pet or companion animal grief would be in the middle. So that's sort of category where there is growing recognition that those are really deep losses, but there's still sometimes ridicule or people having sort of critical attitudes that why are you mourning that it's only a cat or dog, which is of course very harmful for the persons who are grieving. So those feelings help us to engage with the losses. They can also help us to cherish what remains. So there's very important functions in these feelings. And in the context of ecological crisis, it's also an ethical task of bearing witness.
The ethical task, I think, is really important. And we have a section in the guide about the fact that just because we acknowledge grief doesn't mean that we're giving up on climate action. Right.
Exactly, Anya. I think that's a hugely important point, and because people and communities haven't often been dealing with ecological grief, there may be various kinds of presuppositions or prejudices against it. And I've heard many environmentalists sort of say that, oh, if we go there, then we will be paralyzed. But luckily, that's not the whole truth. If there's constructive engagement, it can actually be a strong motivating force.
Wonderful. Yes, the motivating force part is really important, and there's so much in the guide about connecting grief with other types of emotions and motivations. I wanted to, the other part that I find so affirming and entering into this learning with you is when we talk about climate anxiety, there's an overtone of pathologization. I mean, some anxiety is normal, but anxiety in general we think of as pathological, whereas grief is not pathological, right?
Yeah, it can be helpful. And of course, there's the dimension of so-called complicated grief or prolonged grief, and that's a discussion in the medical spheres. For example, if a close person has died and you are still very distressed after one year, so that would be an example of there's some complications and it's prolonged. But I agree with you that there's less potential for pathologizing in relation, especially to sadness, than with anxiety.
And it just helps us understand and recognize the reality of what's happening to us, I think.
Mm. Yeah, and after all, it's a great joining force. We are all inside these major changes, and it's so natural to have these complex emotions and feelings about them. And unfortunately, very often so far, that hasn't come to the surface, but I would see a great potential for people finding connections to each other if we together engage with this.
Absolutely. So that's a great segue, actually. We have a lot of different activities in the guide, and they're designated, right, for both alone and in partnership with others, right?
Exactly.
So we're going to go through the guide in a minute, and you're going to get your first look at the graphically designed version after we worked on it for many months together. But I did want you to kind of begin by introducing us to some of these really helpful concepts about, the temporal nature of this kind of grief, climate and ecological grief, and the ideas of intangible loss and disenfranchised grief. So could you say more about those?
Mm. Yeah, definitely. And a major part of these materials is based on my research article called Ecological Sorrow, Types of Loss and Grief in Ecological Grief. And there I'm applying many concepts and frameworks from general grief research to the context of ecological and climate grief. So intangible loss is one of those. It means to the invisible aspects of losses. When we lose something, we might also lose part of our identity. We might lose the possibilities of doing something together with that close one, whether human or more than human. So there's these invisible aspects which need attention, but they are one kind of loss which easily then gets disenfranchised. So that's a famous term in grief research developed by Kenneth in the late 1980s. Disenfranchised grief, meaning grief which is not given social support or validation. And that has regrettably happened very often in relation to ecological grief. And also there may be intersectional issues here, different kinds of sorrows and grievances that people experience, but which are not recognized by others or the mainstream society. Then the list would continue into ambiguous loss. Something is partly lost and partly not. That can also be more easily disenfranchised because people can be optimistic and say, well, perhaps it's not completely lost type of thing. And then extending to the temporalities. So some losses are continuous or non-finite, as the term goes in research. And then there can be anticipation of future losses or some kind of transitional periods where we then feel what might be called transitional loss and grief. So there's different kinds of dynamics and aspects, and we hope that these terms would help people to engage with them. But of course, information is important, but it's not everything, and that's why we work together with Anya and others to trying to provide ideas for how to engage with them with more senses.
I really appreciate that. I also have to say that learning about these concepts from you has been very clarifying for me as well, and thinking about analogies to other life experiences. For example, the disenfranchised grief of losing a pregnancy,
Mm.
or the non-finite loss, which is sometimes, for example, if you have an elderly parent whose health is declining and they're partly here and partly gone, that's the ambiguous grief. So there's a lot of experiences that we're all having all the time. And I just think naming them is tremendously helpful. So thank you for this.
Good to hear, Anya.
I'm going to share my screen and going to show you, and I should let people know that it's not the final version of the guide. There's some changes and that may be made in the final version, but I did want to give you the first chance to look at what we created together in the designed version. So this is our all about climate grief, what to know and what to do about it. And as you can see here, we've got what to know about climate and ecological grief and different models. And this is from a wide background of different researchers, right, who've created grief processes, not just for climate ecological grief, right?
Exactly.
And then we have the anatomy of climate grief, which you just talked about a little bit, and there's a wonderful group of images for that. And then finally, we're going to have the activities guide, which we're going to get to. We started with our climate emotions wheel, which was our first co-creation based on your research. And here we're zooming in onto sadness, right? And the feelings of sadness. Although you talk about how grief can connect to other emotions as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. And here we can see guilt and shame, which are so often present in people's processes of grief, but also, anger in many forms, threat-related emotions. So also for me, over the last decade, learning more about grief processes has really helped me to see more nuances and dimensions in processes of eco anxiety and grief.
Wonderful, wonderful. I wanted to call out this term socio-political grief. Can you explain what that?
Mm. Yes, so warm thanks to all the various grief researchers and ecological grief activists whose materials and resources we are applying here. One of them is Darcy Harris, a noted grief scholar who has been writing in the last 5 years about political grief and socio-political grief. So that explains how people may feel grief and grievance because of what's happening in the political sphere or the socio-political sphere. And sometimes that can be pretty deep, even people's fundamental assumptions about what the world is like may be threatened or even shattered due to events in global politics.
I know exactly what you mean.
Mm, mm,
A very personal experience for many Americans right now.
yes.
This area of generational grief across generations is something we've worked on quite a bit at Climate Mental Health Network, and I wonder if you could say a few words about how this expresses itself when you are becoming a parent or are a parent of adult children, even.
Mm. Yes, and in this group of materials which we are publishing, there's also a handy sort of tip and resource sheet for parents and educators, and great work, Anya, with that also. So children are born with abilities to feel sadness and grief. So it's actually sometimes a learning experience for the adults to to look at how children react to losses, and they have their channels for crying open and so on. And then later on, there's often complications in industrialized societies. But then again, there's also the challenges of parents and educators in how to deal with ecological and climate grief that children and young people feel. And we try to offer some guidance for this, and luckily many psychologists have lately been working on that topic.
Absolutely, absolutely. I want to show the images that go with the concepts, and then I'm going to actually come
Mm,
back to this graphic, which is also taken
mm,
from your research, if
mm,
that's okay,
mm,
as I
mm.
start to wrap up here. But so these are the can you explain the origins of this set of images?
Yes, so uh, Finnish young graphic designer Santtu Oja has made the images. I had some fundamental ideas, and then we co-designed them. So hopefully the images might tell something about the particular type of loss or grief which is at hand.
So we have complicated grief, intangible or tangible losses, non-finite loss we talked about. ambiguous loss, disenfranchised grief. It might separate you from other people, I guess, is that the image.
Yeah, exactly.
And transitional loss and grief. Can you say a word about that? Actually, that's an interesting one.
Mm. Yes, and in general grief research, I think this is easily seen in aging people, for example. So there's a transition, and those transitions may well include things that are meaningful and things that are sad. So it can be a combination. So sometimes it's not totally non-finite, even though the transitional period may be long. And I think this is something that we are globally now living in societies which have relied on fossil fuels, for example. So there's the long, difficult transition into more sustainable economic ways. And that's one example of a difficult transition which also causes many feelings of loss and grief.
Right, right, absolutely. But thinking about the concept of transition and adjustment, I do want to bring us back, and maybe we'll end by talking about the process model, right? Because we're never leaving grief entirely behind, but there's a there are transitions and processing that happen, right? Can you talk about the transformation of grief?
Mm. Yes, thanks for asking. And often in processes of grief, there's a first more acute, perhaps more difficult phase, even though, situations are very different, and sometimes it can be that people first sort of avoid it and then it hits you later on. But anyway, in addition to this first more acute phase, there's the longer term dimensions, and the image we are seeing here is from my process model of eco-anxiety and grief, based on evaluating lots of different kinds of research and then putting it together into a rather simple but hopefully still nuanced enough model. So there's the three dimensions of coping and changing, action, grieving, and distancing, which refer to the need to get feelings of efficacy from action, to deal with losses and feelings of grief, and also to take care of ourselves. So there's a dimension of self-care and community care there. And all this is related to the goal of adjustment and transformation. So not just returning to where we were, but the global situation is requiring us to grow and change. So there's a kind of post-traumatic growth dimension here, or adversarial growth dimension, but then there may be new kinds of events which then sort of push us back to the need to engage more strongly with feelings of grief and loss, for example. So there may be cyclical elements here, but it's also possible to have growth and transformation, and that is highly important, of course.
We're in the spring, and it's the season of very intense blossoms here in New York City and many places in the East Coast. And it just really reminds me of the cycles of nature, right? And the fact that we enjoy the blossoms of spring entirely because of their transience. And this is an observation going back to the ancient Japanese poets, right? And that's why there's an association of flowers with death, in fact, because of the fact that they're there for a moment and then they're gone, and that helps us enjoy their beauty with that intensity.
Thanks, Anya. That's a very profound example of the intertwining of life and death and loss and new growth and life.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to stop our share. I'm going to thank you so much for all of your generosity and working with us. And I hope that these resources reach a lot of people. And yeah, just want to say thanks again.
Thank you, Anya. Lovely to talk and work with you.